Hi everybody, I'm Phil Liggett. They call me the voice of cycling, and I was a special guest on episode 85 of the famous Physical Performance Show, which is approaching its 200th edition now in February 2020. I just want to say congratulations to all the guys involved. It's a great listen, and I really enjoyed the small part I played in it. So here's to a very successful and happy new year.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by fisiocrem and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes, expert and featured performer episodes, coaches' corners, and interest editions. And on today's episode, we take a look back at the top 10 highlights from the 2019 Expert Editions. The Expert Editions are designed to bring you the learnings and the teachings from some of the world's preeminent experts in their chosen fields, as it relates to the show's mission, which is to help you perform at your physical best. There were a multitude of themes explored via the Expert Editions in 2019. Recovery science, psychology, running shoes and orthoses, strength and conditioning, nutrition for the athlete, and optimizing training workloads. In 2019, the Physical Performance Show grew by a staggering 60%, and the Expert Editions really were rocket fuel to the show's growth. So here are some of the most memorable and top 10 teachings/learnings from 2019's Expert Editions. And we kick off the year in review of the Expert Editions with the most popular episode for 2019, the most downloaded, the most shared. And that was my exploration around optimizing training intensities, the polarized training approach, with acclaimed sports scientist Dr. Stephen Seiler. Dr. Seiler has been at the forefront of how the world's best endurance athletes distribute their training intensity. And his findings, which are that the world's best elite endurance athletes spend 80 to 90% of their total training time in what he refers to as Zone 1, or aerobic, easy work, and 10 to 20% in Zone 3, or if you like, hard, intense work, and very little in the middle, at or around anaerobic threshold. And the mistake that most recreational athletes make, the time-pressed weekend warrior, is to spend too many minutes of our week's training load in the middle in what Dr. Seiler terms the training intensity black hole. Here's a little snippet of Dr. Seiler sharing around how what the elites do scales down to the time-pressed recreational athlete, and why we must be disciplined to make our easy sessions easy and our hard sessions hard.
And the most common question that I have received over the last few years is, well, yeah, that works for athletes doing 20 hours plus a week, but I only do 5 or 7. Surely I should just work hard every day. And I get that, but the fact is, no, that's not true. That also those of us who are only training, I'm in that area, 8 hours a week. And if I try to train threshold level all those workouts, I get cooked. I know even just going a little bit too hard for me, and I feel it. But if I am disciplined and I keep my easy sessions where they belong, then I actually look forward to the hard sessions and get the chance to kind of, push on the accelerator and test my wings. And that, then you're kind of in the right balance. And time after time, I've gotten feedback from age group athletes and amateurs that say, yes, this made a difference. It helped. It took me a couple months, but I'm better now. So I know it works.
And do you think it's mainly driven the mistakes that so many athletes make, as we alluded to, I've made them, you've made them, is because of those time constraints when, if people aren't professional, that they fear that if they don't have the intensity in there, they won't get the gains? Is it driven by fear, or what do you think are the underlying drivers for why, despite a growing awareness of, this phrase that you've coined, the polarized training, being more known, I believe, worldwide, what do you think drives the behaviours of people to, as we'll elaborate on in a moment, get stuck in that zone 2 middle?
Well, I think it's just human nature. I still struggle with it to this day. If I'm on Zwift and someone cycles by me, the temptation, there's always that initial reflex to jump on their wheel or try to ride past them again, even though I've told myself, look, you're going to go 200 watts for 2 hours today. Be smart. Practice what you preach. Those temptations are still there. And I think it's just we have a tendency to accelerate or push the pressure because we can. And then unfortunately we keep doing that, and then we get to those hard sessions, and then suddenly it's not there. And so I used to call this a training intensity black hole, where the intensity of your workouts gets kind of sucked in towards the middle. You go harder on easy days because you can, and then you end up going a bit slower on hard days because you're fatigued. And so things move towards the middle. And that is precisely what the best athletes are able to avoid.
And I've heard you say, Stephen, that the mentality is they have this discipline, but, as you say, it's hard to let someone ride past you on Zwift, yet the elites will let people run past them. And, as you alluded to, they have a plan and they work that plan and they stick to it, and then they let their numbers do the talking on race day.
Yeah, I think that's, a worthwhile kind of thing we can work on, is just have self-confidence. Be confident in yourself, be confident in your plan, and smile when the rider goes by you. That may be their hard day, or they may be thrilled to be riding past you. Let them enjoy it. If you know what you're good for. And I think that if you can learn to be magnanimous, and at the same time know, hey, come back tomorrow because tomorrow's my hard day, then I think you'll end up being a better athlete, but also, I think, a better athlete to ride with, because it's tough to always ride with people that are competing every workout or ride, run, whatever. There's a tendency, if you fall into this situation where the people you're training with make every workout a competition, then they're probably not the best people for you to train with.
Highlight number 2 was the wonderful sharings from Expert Edition, episode 151, featuring acclaimed sports scientist Dr. Tim Gabbett. Dr. Gabbett shared on load management and the pursuit of building the unbreakable athlete and maximising performance. Here is Dr. Tim Gabbett sharing around why training harder may in fact be training smarter, and why it is in many instances that when athletes develop overuse injuries, it may not just be about overuse, but rather under preparation of their body's capacity. This fits in so well with Dr. Seiler's sharings around why we need to be intensity disciplined with our training approach, because as you'll hear from Dr. Tim Gabbett, building a large chronic training base, accruing lots of time in zone 1 over weeks, months and years has been shown in the science to be protective against injury.
Of training are going to be the same whether whether you take a team sport athlete, whether you take someone from the military and special ops, whether you take someone from the circus, or whether you take a marathon runner. If I take someone and ask them to do more than what they're prepared for, then the results are going to be pretty consistent. You're going to increase injury risk. Now, that doesn't mean you're definitely going to break down, but you are going to increase risk. But we also know that when you get to those higher workloads, then it creates a robustness. You have to impose stress on the body in order to handle stress, in order to handle the load that comes with training. You have to load your body. So, if you're a marathon runner and you want to be able to run a fast marathon, then you have to build up to the kind of speeds that you're going to run in a marathon. You may not ever run a marathon in one single training session, but you're putting a program in place to allow you to cope with the acute load spike that comes with a marathon. So it might be a 42-kilometre race, but you need to put enough load in place, enough chronic load in place over a period of time to allow you to cope with that acute load spike of 42 kilometres. And that's what I'm talking about with developing robustness and resilience that comes with training.
And I really love the hashtag that, a lot of people are using there on social media to reference what you do, and that's this hashtag train smarter and harder. So, obviously there's been this awareness of the impact of loading on potential injury risk, both in athletic individuals and also teams. But then I think as you've outlined in one of your most recent papers about debunking some of the myths around loading, you really speak to the fact that just trying to stay in a safe zone at times is not necessarily the answer, that, you've got to train hard and you've got to sometimes surpass certain levels of loading to build that resilience. So training harder is not something to be avoided. It's not an antidote to injuries to not do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, Brad. Like, we hear a lot that I'm not training harder, I'm training smarter. We hear it a lot, and typically it's from people who are at the back end of their career, and they're somewhere along the line, this has been what they've been told. The second point is that from the original training injury prevention paradox paper, I think a lot of people took the acute chronic ratio and said, okay, well, training smarter involves the acute chronic ratio. And the thing that I really want to emphasize about from that paper and from the subsequent debunking of myths paper is that the actual training harder part seems to be kind of missed in it all. The acute chronic ratio tends to fly around, but the actual part of training harder seems to be missed. And that the point that's really worth taking away is training harder might actually be training smarter, because if we wrap our players in cotton wool, we wrap our runners in cotton wool, and manage them away from training load, and then think they're going to be able to handle the demands of a marathon, or think they're going to be able to handle the demands of an 82 or a 162 game season, then of course we're going to be mistaken. So, and the other point, the really important point to take away is that higher chronic loads are associated with lower injury risk. And this is the point that goes against pretty much all of our thinking. When we pick up any textbook on, sports medicine textbook, it says that overuse injuries occur due to training too hard. They overuse injuries occur to overtraining. No one ever stops and questions that and goes, well, actually overuse injuries can occur due to under preparation, due to under training. And that's the big thing that we've noticed, is that training harder is actually associated with lower injury risk. So that is a form of training smarter. If you can train harder, then it is a form of training smarter. But you can't just go from 0 to 100% and think that's going to be a smart way to go. And that's where the acute chronic ratio comes in handy, because it allows you to safely progress and regress loads. So the two go together. And that's what allows you to train smart and train hard.
Fueling for the endurance athlete proved to be a hot topic in 2019. On episode 178, I caught up with Trent Stellingworth, PhD, Director of Performance Solutions for the Canadian Sports Institute. And I asked Dr. Stellingworth for some key advice around fueling for the marathon.
Generally speaking, you only need about 250 to 300 mLs per bottle because it's pretty hard to fuel much more than about 150 to 200 at each aid station. You want a little bit extra. If you overfill your bottles, you're just carrying extra weight. You want a little bit extra, but you don't need a full liter in there. Practice with carrying the bottle for a while. We found over time that people tend to consume more when they just take the time with the bottle, and it tends to result in a little less of a bloated feeling and perhaps a little less air sucked in and other things. You can practice fueling, and it does get easier when you practice, even for the elite athletes who are running well under 5-minute miles and around 3 minutes per kilometer pace. You do need to practice pulling it off the aid table too, because at those paces for the elites, the tables come pretty fast. For non-elites, it's a whole other ball game, and you really need to do your homework on the race website of finding out where the aid tables are, what is at each of the aid tables. Some of them are water only, some of them are water and sports drink, all in cups, and some of them will feature gels. Things like gels are pretty easy to carry on you, and so you should practice carrying gels. For example, if you haven't practiced before and you're a woman or a guy that slips a gel into the waistband of your shorts or in your sports bra, I've seen horror stories where it's rubbed the wrong way and you're bleeding halfway through the race. So again, just practice ahead of time with how you're going to carry those, what they're going to look like. Time your gels around water stations. Because if you take a gel and it's all gummy and sticky in your mouth, there's nothing worse. Like you do need water with the gel. So it's, again, practicing that. With the cups, ideally the aid stations half fill all the cups. There's nothing worse than going to an aid station, grabbing a full cup, because half of it's going to spill out all over you anyways. When you grab the cup it almost completely closed, so pinch it. And then as you run, it's pinched. Less of it spills out, and you can actually kind of siphon it into your mouth. Again, practice with these paper cups so that you get really good at doing that. It might require a slight slowdown in pace with the paper cups, but if you're able to fuel and get a few of those in, it's quite effective. Get a little weigh scale and measure how well you're at, and measure actually how much you're getting down. Because remember, 1 milliliter or 1 kilogram of water weight equals 1,000 milliliters. So 1 gram equals 1 milliliter. You can actually say, oh, wow, I actually only took in 15 milliliters there, 1 gram of carb. I'm going to have to practice that a little bit more. So those are just some really practical advice on getting fueling in during a race.
Keeping the theme of fueling for optimal performance going, on episode 155, Brisbane-based sports dietitian Andrew Hall shared some fantastic race day rules. Andrew's episode was one of the most downloaded in 2019. Here's some great tips from sports dietitian Andrew Hall for your next upcoming event.
Number one rule for sports nutrition when it comes to race day is don't try anything new on race day. So whatever you're doing, you want to make sure that you've done it before, you feel comfortable, the foods work for you. And I really like that. I really love working with people in this space because, races can be quite nerve-wracking. And the last thing we want people doing is being nervous around their food, questioning whether or not it's going to meet their needs. Will it work for me this time? Am I going to bonk again? So working with an individual before they get to that point is one of the biggest things that we do, I would say. Let's say early morning run or triathlon, you want to get up, and I would generally try and have a bigger meal sort of 2 to 3 hours before. something that is higher in carbohydrates, lower in fat, lower in fibre, just because they're not useful nutrients at that point in time, and we don't want a lot of residual fibre in the digestive tract during that next few hours. Then what you want to do is obviously make sure that your hydration, so sipping on water or a sports drink, depending on the individual, in the lead up to that race. And then once the gun goes off, then it depends on the amount of time that race is going for. If the particular event is sub 3 hours, then you generally want to be aiming for between 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. If the race is going 3 hours plus, then that's when I would get people to try and train their guts to be to digest 60 to 75 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So it really depends on the duration. And as you sort of heard me mention, you want to make sure that you've trained your body to be able to exercise at an intensity and consume that certain amount of carbohydrates or fuel, because it's not as simply as I don't like to eat gels, I won't train on them, and then all of a sudden on race day just change it and grab the free gels that are on the side of the race and expect it to be okay.
Okay, so we ideally would be implementing this into our training.
Absolutely, you want a few trial runs from a nutrition point of view, so you've got that confidence and you know that the product works for you, the amount and the timing works for you as well.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And in terms of ingesting a gel, for example, say during a marathon, is there any merit in the information around just gently sort of sipping it, so to speak, over a period of time versus one big dollop of the contents of the gel?
Look, it's not something that I've seen a lot of science on that particular aspect. So if you're talking about like sports gels in particular, or the carbohydrate gels, generally I would get those people to sort of get it out of their pocket ready as they're entering an aid station, consume the gel reasonably quickly, and then pick up some water and drink that, or pick up some fluid and drink that to help get that down into the gut and get the digestion going. Okay,
so no, that's great. Race day, you get through the event, and then obviously then your event's completed, that then feeds into the recovery strategies that you just shared a moment ago.
Yeah, you've crossed the line with another PB would be ideal.
On episode 173, we took a psychological deep dive with Australian-based sports clinical psychologist and author Dr. Joe Lukens. Dr. Joe shared around the role of psychology in injury rehabilitation, why people who are optimistic tend to do better in life, how to evaluate our success or our failures, and why enhancing self-esteem through the right coaching cues is so paramount. For me, one of the standout share-ins from Dr. Joe was when she explained the concept of one of her book chapter titles from her book, The Elite, Embracing the Suck. Here is Dr. Joe on why it's powerful to embrace the suck.
I really enjoy this topic because I think it's so pertinent to all of us with all the different things that we do. And I have to say the phrase itself was adapted from the military, because I do quite a bit of work with defence personnel here in Townsville. So there's a thing that's called mil speak, which is military speak. And the notion of the suck in military terms is that sometimes you just have to do tasks that are not quite palatable. So it might be, and I'm going to oversimplify it, but it might be stand here for 2 hours, dig the hole, right now fill it in again. So sometimes you've just got to do stuff and it's unpleasant. When I was a student at uni, I worked in a cafe and I used to clean dishes for 10 hours a day. It was not my most fun job that I ever had. What we find when we're competing in sport as well is that there are days when our training is not all rainbows and lollipops, that there are early mornings, there is lots of effort, there is hard work, and, to use an Australian expression, sometimes it sucks. And it does, and that's kind of the point. So which is one of my mantras. One of my mantras is it's kind of the point. I went riding this morning. It was 4:30 and it was cold. So I would hope that I would be training with a level of intensity if I'm going to get up that early, and experience those conditions. So the notion to embrace the suck is to acknowledge that if you've got to do it anyway, find a way to make it palatable. So if you are doing some physical training and it's tough, then before you start it, tell yourself why you're there. Why are you doing this? So maybe this is your opportunity to get stronger. Maybe this is your opportunity to get faster. Maybe this is your opportunity to experience discomfort. So when you can do those things and you can embrace the suck rather than fight it, you don't burn as much mental energy in getting the task done. So one of the things that we do at the Army is that we talk about this concept, and we look at some strategies for, and one of the key things you can do is, challenge and rephrase how you describe something. And I'm going to come back to my beautiful Castle Hill here in Townsville. I was walking up the hill one day, and there were two fellows who came up behind me, and it was just the way we all walked towards the water cooler, is that they kind of walked either side of me. And one of them turned to the other one and just said, as they were coming past me, he said, "Oh, that was horrible." He said, "I hated that. That was so hard." And I think they had run up the hill, which is a tough thing to do. And he just said, "That was awful." And the other fellow actually had like an MP3 player on him, but they were playing the speakers out so that they could both hear it. And he turned to him, smiled, and said, "Yeah, I know, but now that we're at the top," he said, "we can dance." And he danced to the water cooler. And it was a really good example of two men who had both gone through the same physical challenge. One of them had labelled it as horrible and uncomfortable, and it sucked and it was awful, and the other one saw it as an opportunity to get to the top and dance. So they both had to do it anyway. But in terms of as an experience, and one of the things that we know is that when you embrace an experience, and particularly when you're grateful for the experience, you tend to perform better. So there's some really interesting new research coming through about the benefits of gratitude for athletes, which isn't just about happiness, but it's about performance as well. So embracing the suck is really about your ability to acknowledge, well, if I'm going to do it anyway, I may as well find a way to make it palatable for me. Why is this a good session for me to be doing? How will this make me wiser at the end? So you can do some of those kind of things and then almost be grateful for the opportunity to go out there. We were talking before about injury. If we were injured, we'd all wish we could get up and do a tough training session. So, when we're a bit more grateful for why we're out there and what we're doing, we'll perform better.
On episode 148, we got really practical as I caught up with UK-based strength and conditioning expert, PhD in exercise physiology, and author of Strength and Conditioning for Endurance Running, Richard Blagrove. Richard took a deep dive into the world of how, the what, and the why on all things strength and conditioning for runners. It was a real practical exploration that every runner and indeed endurance athlete would benefit from. Here's Richard sharing around the manifold benefits of strength and conditioning for runners, and also debunking one of the common myths that runners have around strength and conditioning, and that is the fear of bulking up.
In terms of performance, first of all, the majority of the scientific literature, so we're talking between 20 and 25 studies, has shown that we see improvements in running economy of between about 2 and 8% after 2 to 3 months of engaging with a strength training program. So for your listeners, running economy is defined as the energy cost or the amount of energy that we're using at some sort of submaximal running intensity up to about 10 kilometre pace. So essentially, if we get a reduction in running economy, we're using less energy and also less oxygen for the same intensity of effort or the same running speed. And so there's a little bit of controversy within the scientific community, especially, who say that running economy is obviously this sort of physiological construct that we measure in laboratories, and does it actually have very much real world relevance? But in quite a few of those studies, they also measure time trial performance over distances of 1,500 metres all the way up to 10,000 metres. And again, typically those studies are showing that we see improvements in time trial performance in a group that have done 2 or 3 strength training sessions a week for a few months compared to a group that just carried on their normal running. So it does seem that the benefits that we get with running economy also translate into performance improvements. And there has been a couple of publications that are showing that there does seem to be a direct link to something that's a bit more usable for runners. The other big area that it just seems to improve is more anaerobic type qualities. So what I mean by anaerobic is any sorts of performance which doesn't use oxygen, so high intensity type efforts. So things like maximal sprint speed typically seems to change after a period of strength training. So that has obvious advantages if you're a high performing distance runner, and where you see typically races being won in sprint finishes. But for any type of distance runner, right down to recreational, if we can raise your top speed sprinting and we compare that to a submaximal running speed, which there's obviously quite a big difference, if we can increase that difference, we improve something called the anaerobic speed reserve. So essentially running at lower intensities feels a little bit easier because our top speed, our kind of ceiling of maximal effort has improved a little bit. So those are kind of the 3 main performance areas that we see improved. And as you alluded to in your question, it's also quite strongly believed in physios, clinicians and strength and conditioning coaches that we see a reduction in injury risk as a result of performing strength training over an extended period of time. So typically for me, that's things like improving bone mineral density, because we see a relatively high rate of stress fractures in distance runners. Improving tendon and ligament resilience is also really important. And also just improving coordination generally. So I think if you're performing resistance training very well, we're not just getting benefits to the lower limb musculature, but we're getting improvements in posture and we're getting improvements in coordination on just quite basic functional movements. So there are bits and pieces of evidence floating around that we see subtle changes in some kinematic variables during the running action, particularly if we're performing strength training around the hip, and I'm referring to like the glute muscles mainly.
And Rich, of all those things, if nothing was attractive, I think one thing that every runner would gravitate towards is an improvement in time trial performance. Obviously,
absolutely.
The injury reductions.
Yeah, and that's the most important thing to mention. And I can talk all day about VO2 max and running economy and so on, but those types of construct don't have much meaning to a runner. They're like, is this going to make me quicker? Is it going to make me get me a personal best performance? Is it going to win me a race? And it's difficult to answer that, but the majority of evidence suggests that it will help. So I think that needs to be the main message.
Absolutely, and if that grabs the attention of a runner who perhaps is listening in and not yet strength training, I think this next section will explore, which is common myths around strength and conditioning that you may be able to dispel. And then we can loop back and sort of wrestle those injury reduction benefits and performance benefits to the ground a little bit with some specifics. So, Rich, common things that I hear in practice as a full-time practitioner, physiotherapist, when I may share that a runner would benefit from some strength training or strength and conditioning. One would be, and you write about it in your book, and that is lifting weights will make me put on muscle. I'm a runner. I don't want to be bulky. So what do you say to that?
No, I fully agree with you. It's a common concern that I hear in the running community. And it's a very reasonable concern as well, because I think, as I've already mentioned, if we see a substantial increase in mass over a long period of time, which may or may not be attributed to a resistance training program, that's obviously going to be detrimental to a runner. They've got to carry that mass around with them for the distance that they run. I mean, again, if we look at the scientific literature, so all those studies that I mentioned that have used strength training and resistance exercise over 2 or 3 month periods to try and look at changes in physiology and changes in structure, like very, very few of them see any sorts of change in body mass. And a study that I actually did as part of my PhD, where we took a group of 25 young distance runners who were aged between 15 and 18, we separated them out into two groups, one that did strength training twice a week for 10 weeks and another group that just carried on their normal running. And in both groups, we didn't see any change in body mass as a result of those two different types of intervention. And so I think on the face of it, like, runners shouldn't be too worried that they're going to put on any mass, because there isn't much evidence that it actually happens. And it's probably because the sorts of volumes that the volumes of resistance training that those studies are using and that I used as part of my PhD study are actually relatively low, just in the context of just resistance training generally. And so when you look at the amount of volume that like a bodybuilder would do, or even somebody in the general population that starts doing resistance training in a gym, like, they're much higher than typically I would prescribe for a runner, and these types of studies are using. So I think the first thing to say is you don't need to do very much volume to get stronger and achieve some of the benefits that I've already outlined. And the second thing is we tend to see something which is termed an interference effect when we combine aerobic types of training and strength training as part of the same training program. So although it seems to be beneficial to aerobic type qualities if we do resistance training, we tend to see a little bit of blunting of strength type adaptations. And one type of strength adaptation that we get from resistance training is an increase in muscle mass, which is known as hypertrophy. So if we're seeing a little bit of blunting in a hypertrophy response as when we combine aerobic and strength training in the same program, that's actually kind of a good thing for the distance runner, because we don't want to put on any sort of muscle mass. So if we're seeing gains in strength, which are probably coming from nervous system type adaptations, but we're not really seeing a change in muscle mass, then that's obviously going to be most beneficial.
On episode 153, we did a deep dive into all things running shoes, the modern running shoe, trends, misconceptions, and must-know information. I caught up with acclaimed sports podiatrist Simon Bartold and his colleague Paul Griffin. Between them, their careers span more than 50 years in the sports podiatry world, and they shared some great practical takeaways on what to do when selecting your next pair of running shoes. Here's Paul Griffin and Simon Bartold's top 3 tips on how to select your next pair of running shoes.
I would say the number one tip is do not make wholesale changes. So in other words, do not be seduced into going from the shoe that you're used to a much lower drop shoe, because that is a recipe for disaster unless you are prepared to radically reduce your training and build up again. So that's a big issue. And that is not a commentary on minimalism. It's just a fact that you can't make the body doesn't respond well to radical changes. I would say choose the lightest weight footwear you can find that will work for you within the confines of that lightweight. And finally, if it's not comfortable, then it's not the right shoe for you.
Brilliant. So just to recap, don't make massive changes. Light ideally is better if you can find that, and look for comfort. Thank you, Simon. Paul, what would be your top 3 practical tips for the runner going to buy a pair of shoes tomorrow?
I definitely feel, firstly, the retailer. So make sure it's a reputable running shoe retailer that offer a range of options that would be suitable, and I think that also fits in with the fit for intended use. So don't go to a specialty trail running store to buy road running shoes. I'll just make an example here, but don't go to a store that won't be able to provide that service to you. I think sort of along the same lines as Simon, be realistic with what type of shoe you like. I always say this. I really, when I was back living in Perth, I really enjoyed surfing, and I was surfing a lot. And for many years, I just bought similar board dimensions to Kelly Slater, although I was something like 35 kilos heavier. So I wanted to surf like Slater, but I just, I wasn't fit for that mould. And I think that similar sort of thing with footwear is just, if we all like the lightweight racy types, but sometimes it's just too minimalist can sometimes not be a good thing. So I would sort of find something that would be suitable, and then it's not probably fitting in with the pre-purchase thing, but after the purchase thing, I wouldn't go bashing out in new footwear, doing too much too soon. So ease your way into them, and get a bit of a feeling for what's happening there, and progress slowly.
And turn left instead of right, for goodness sake.
Turn left. Yeah.
Turn left, mate.
I can only turn left.
One of the great trends in health and wellness and sporting pursuits is the rise in the awareness around the importance of sleep for the athlete. Starting the year off in 2019, we explored the topic of sleep for performance and health when I caught up with medical doctor, sleep specialist, Melbourne Sleep Disorders Centre Director, Dr. David Cunnington. This was one of the most popular episodes for the calendar year, and here is Dr. Cunnington sharing around why the mantra rise and grind could possibly be replaced with the mantra sleep in and win, and why it is that if you wake up and feel like you need to hit the snooze button, you may in fact have slept better than you perceived.
Yeah, absolutely. It's particularly in the exercise world, it's, rise and grind. So we just got to replace rise and grind with sleep in and win. That's the mantra to go with.
Sleep in and win.
Because that's what the data suggests. Really good data about getting that extra bit of sleep, that recovery that's associated with that, and that improving performance. Whereas you're right, culturally it's the, go harder. The way I'm going to win is I'm just going to put in more hours than everybody else, and that's what's going to get me ahead. But, yeah, not necessarily so.
It's morning time and our alarm clocks obtusely wake us up. We roll over and hit snooze. Can you speak to what's happening when we do that, and we then hit it a second time and have the little feeling that we're winning because we're getting an extra 10 or 15 minutes? Is that effective? Is it not? Any suggestions now for getting up in the morning, Dr. Cunnington?
Man, I must have set you up with that question. This is perfect. So we all have an internal body clock, and that body clock has a cycle length. Now, we live on a planet that has a 24-hour cycle length, but for humans, the median cycle length is 24 hours and 17 minutes. So for the median of the human population, when the alarm goes in the morning, exactly 24 hours after the time it went off the day before, biologically it feels like it's 17 minutes too early, and that is 2 hits of the snooze button. So that is finding that you need to hit the snooze button twice before you feel like you can, now my feet can hit the floor and I can start to get going. You're right, bang on the median for a normal population. So feeling like you need to hit the snooze button twice is being human. That aspirational thing we have of waking just before the alarm and leaping out of bed and the sun shining and there's flowers blooming, that's 3 in 100 of the population have an internal body clock of 24 hours, 00 minutes or shorter. And so that's just an aspirational, non-biological phenomenon that we get sold. But if you ate enough vitamins or you were virtuous enough or you trained hard enough, you could turn yourself into that person. Some of the things blog posts that do my head in is the how to make yourself a 4 a.m. person. And it's just, go harder, try harder. It's a biological thing rather than a motivational thing. So, hitting the snooze button twice, completely normal. Now, there are sort of tails to that internal body clock length. So some people are a bit shorter. They're the early morning types, but they're the minority. The majority, or it's a bigger tail at the later night type, so the night owls who are going to be more than 2 hits the snooze button. They're going to be, feel it more like a 24-hour, 30-minute body clock or even a 24-hour, 45-minute body clock, really feeling like the mornings are pretty tough. So normal to hit the snooze button. The reality is we need to get up at 24 hours, 00 minutes each day because we've got stuff to do and work starts the same time each day and the kids need to get to school. So it's really just recognising it for what it is. Sure, the alarm's gone, 17 minutes too early for my biological clock. This is going to hurt a bit, but you know what? I'm just going to get up and do it. And the getting up and doing it, the being upright, the movement of the large joints, the light into the back of the eyes, putting food into our stomachs, all cues in the body clock to, hey, you thought it was 24 hours, 17 minutes, the time you were supposed to get up. It really is 24 hours, 00 minutes. And it'll reset that so the body clock doesn't drift out day after day after day. So because a lot of people, when they come to see me in my practice and I say, what's the trouble with sleep? I say, well, the trouble I have is when my alarm goes and I first open my eyes, I feel dreadful. I don't feel like I'm ready to start the day. I was like, hello, you're one of the 97 in 100 humans that's a normal phenomenon. So far too often, we're judging how the day is going to go by how we feel when our eyes open. Whereas it's normal to only reach 80% of our performance capacity, both be that cognitive performance or physical performance, 2 hours after we wake up, after our biological awakening time. So really the time to judge how am I tracking, if you're up at 7, is once you're at the desk at 9 o'clock, sort of into your day, now how am I feeling, not when you first open your eyes. Because far too often people, when they first open their eyes, like, oh, today's going to be another tough day because I'm really not feeling like getting up right now.
It's always a treat when we get to explore the writings of an author, let alone a New York Times best-selling author. On episode 187, we explored Christy Ashwinden's New York Times bestseller, Good to Go, what the athlete in all of us can learn from the strange science of recovery. It was one of my favourite reads in 2019, a book I highly recommend. And during the interview, Christy shared around the concept of radical acceptance of where our body is at any given time in a training cycle. Christy shared around the power of recognising how we feel and making wise decisions off the back of that versus blindly pushing through. Closely tied in with this concept is the concept of monitoring our mood versus relying on the data that our watches alone feed us. Christy reiterated that we need to ask ourselves, how am I feeling?
Yeah, there are times when you're under a lot of other stress outside of sport, and that means that your body's ability to absorb stress, to absorb training is going to be diminished. There's a really important concept that I talk about at length in the book, and that is just the idea that training is stress on your body, but so is life stress. And what we need to do is recognize that these two things are sort of, from our body's perspective, they're similar. They're stressors. They are things that are preventing our bodies from, doing the rest and repair that they need. And so your budget for stress may be different at different times of the year, at different times in your life. There are a lot of working professionals who are also pursuing, like, say, Ironmans and things like this in their spare time. But it can be really easy to think, well, I didn't train yesterday because I had this really long day of work, but you weren't necessarily completely resting that day either. If you were, feeling emotional, psychological, life stress, your body was still undergoing some of that stress. So you weren't actually doing ideal recovery. And so it's really important to this goes back to the radical acceptance, right? To accept and understand and be honest with yourself of where you're at and what you can take at a certain amount of time. So it may be that those two Ironman athletes who became age group world champions could have each one of them done similar things on different amounts of training, but those were the amounts that were ideal for them at that time. And I think it's really important to sort of have that radical honesty with yourself of what your body can actually take and what you can respond to at that given time. I think I did sort of expect that there would be some physiological measures that would be, more important than they are. But it turns out that, looking at all of the different things people have looked at in order to sort of measure recovery states, amounts of tiredness and all of that really mood is the absolute best one. And it sort of makes sense if you think of it this way. Our bodies are really sophisticated machines. And what's happening here is your brain is taking all available inputs, the physiological, the psychological, all those sorts of inputs together to produce your mood and to produce this qualitative thing of how you're feeling. So the best thing that you can do when you wake up in the morning is ask yourself, how am I feeling? When you get out there on the field or, out there to go do your workout and you're sort of feeling, how is it feeling to me today? That qualitative feel is actually just as good and in fact better than anything that you can measure on a sports watch or in a blood test or any sort of thing like that. And this has been verified again and again. I mean, there have been in the book, I talk about studies that have been done on this. And for a long time, these sports psychologists that were saying, well, maybe we should look at mood, were kind of poo-pooed a little bit. But eventually, researchers realized that they were really on to something. And in the book, I have a story about this guy from Silicon Valley. He's like a data geek who sort of went through all of this for himself and did all this research and eventually sort of concluded, like these scientists had, that, oh, I don't need all these. He thought he was going to be able to have the magic device. This is someone, who's one of those founders who started companies. And really, if there was a thing to be found by data, it'd be him who would find it. But he eventually concluded that really, he sort of made up his own mood state measure, which was just a numerical rating in the morning, like how is he feeling? And I think that it really is that simple. There are all these things now. HRV is one of them. I mean, these things are interesting. I don't want to dismiss them as entirely useless. They definitely aren't. But the problem is that I think it's really easy, and we're at a time in our culture where this has become very common, where people are sort of looking to the data at the detriment of sort of developing for themselves a sense of their own bodies and a sense of what their bodies are telling them. And so the idea that you're going to learn something new from a sports watch, that's, that measure on your watch, whether it's HRV, whether it's heart rate, if it's something else, those can be informative. They're things that you might pay attention to. And a lot of this is really about learning to pay attention to the right things. But what we see now is that we have athletes who have sort of offloaded the work of understanding what it feels like to be tired, what it feels like to be recovered, what it feels like to be fit. They've offloaded this to the data. And so they're looking to the data and they're trusting the data before they're trusting their own bodies. And I think that's really dangerous.
Furthering on the exploration of recovery and the popularity of the sharings of Christy Ashwindon, I sought out one of the most cited experts in Christy's book, Australian-based recovery expert, Associate Professor Dr. Shona Halson, to continue the deep dive on all things recovery for the athlete. Shona shared around why athlete recovery matters, why it is that fewer athletes than we would perceive are actually overtrained, the critical role that sleep plays in an athlete's recovery and adaptability to absorb training, why we must listen to our bodies, and Shona further explored the science around popular recovery modalities including cryotherapy and other recovery products. Here's Shona sharing around the paradox of fatigue and sleepiness.
It's really interesting, and I'm sure, some of your listeners might have experienced it too. Maybe you've done a long race, or you've spent a lot of time, in a high intensity training block, and you feel fatigued, and you walk and you see athletes, they're walking around tired all the time, but that doesn't mean they're actually sleepy. So when we ask questions around sleep, we're very careful to ask about sleepiness and not fatigue. And you would think that athletes getting around this tired from all the training that they're doing would sleep, and they'd sleep well and they'd go into a good deep sleep. But there's been a couple of studies, and we've done one of them as well, where there was a really high intensity training block and the athletes had more disturbed sleep. And what we think it might be related to is, especially like if you look back to prehistoric times, people, when there was a danger or a threat, whether that, and back then it was obviously usually like a physical threat, people wouldn't sleep, or someone would stay awake to make sure that they protected the group. So when you have like a fight or flight response, because you're stressed about something, you tend to not sleep as well because you're still alert because there's danger out there. And so what we think is that these high levels of training and the physical stress that comes from that, the brain is still interpreting that as stress, and essentially you're getting poorer quality sleep because there's this part of you that's still alert because there's a stress occurring. It just happens to be a physical one. And I think most people can maybe relate to that if you talk about, maybe you're really busy and you've got lots on, you're moving house and you've got all this stuff and you go to bed and you can hardly sleep because your brain's just ticking over. So that's one way of demonstrating that this psychological stress can impede sleep. But we do tend to see this idea of big training blocks instead of being something that results in good sleep might be disturbing sleep for some people because it's just another form of stress.
So there you have it, the 2019 calendar year expert editions in review. If you missed any of the conversations referenced, then I do implore you, jump back and enjoy the full teachings of the experts and be sure to share your learnings with one of your training buddies. For quick links, jump over to pogophysio.com.au for the show notes and all the links to the episodes, or simply jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy the Physical Performance Show from. Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, it's on every platform. A massive thanks to the good folk who make the Physical Performance Show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things graphic design. Another huge thank you to today's show sponsor and longtime supporter of the show, fisiocrem. Fisiocrem is a topical massage cream containing natural plant-based ingredients, ideal for the temporary relief of muscular aches and pains. If you're conscious of what you put on your body, you'll be happy to know that Fisiocrem does not contain parabens or hydroxybenzoates, and its non-greasy formula doesn't leave any sticky residue behind. Fisiocrem can be found Australia-wide at your local Coles, chemist or health store, as well as via their online shop. They've offered listeners of the show 20% off the entire range simply by jumping over to fisiocrem.com.au. That's fisiocrem.com.au. The coupon code is simple, POGO, P-O-G-O. Hurting sucks and Fisiocrem have got your back. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we do a recap on the featured performers, the top moments from their highs, lows, and their learnings. So be sure to be tuning in next week to capture the best of the featured performers from 2019. From there, we'll be resuming episodes with some of the world's leading experts and featured performers, all designed to help inspire and inform you towards your physical best performance. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best. I'm Brad Beer, and this is the Physical Performance Show.